On a stormy night in July 1947, something fell from the sky outside Roswell, New Mexico. Lightning forked across the plains. Thunder cracked above the desert. And when morning came, rancher Mac Brazel found his sheep scattered and his fences broken. But that wasn't all he found. Scattered across a wide stretch of his property were shards of strange, lightweight material, metallic, almost foil-like, but unnaturally strong. Some pieces were etched with symbols, others seemed to shimmer even under cloud cover. Mac had never seen anything like it. He gathered what he could and drove it into town. What happened next would become one of the most iconic and controversial events in modern history. The U.S. Army first declared it had recovered a flying disc. Just hours later, they changed the story. It was a weather balloon. The public accepted the explanation. For a time, but buried under that dusty July storm was the seed of a legend that refuses to die. In this episode, we revisit the crash that sparked decades of speculation. We follow the tangled timeline, from the military's swift retraction, to eyewitnesses who swore they saw alien bodies, to the classified programs that tried to rewrite history. Because Roswell wasn't just a crash site, it was the birthplace of the modern UFO phenomenon. When Mac Brazel arrived in Roswell with his truck bed full of debris, he was directed to the Roswell Army Airfield. There, Intelligence Officer Major Jesse Marcel took interest in the strange metallic scraps. Marcel drove back to the ranch with Brazel to investigate. What they found, according to Marcel's later testimony, stretched nearly a mile across the arid land. The wreckage was unlike anything he had seen during his time in the military. Thin, flexible strips of metal that returned to shape when crumpled. Beams with violet markings. Symbols that resembled hieroglyphics but didn't match any known language. No engines, no wires, no rivets, just pieces of something other. At first, the Army played along. A press release went out on July 8, 1947. The 509th Bomb Group had recovered a, quote, flying disc. Newspapers ran with the story. Headlines across the nation buzzed with excitement. Then, within hours, the official line changed. The Army now claimed the debris was from a weather balloon. Photos were taken of Jesse Marcel holding tattered rubber and wooden struts, decoys for the press. But Jesse Marcel never forgot what he saw. Neither did other members of the recovery team, who would later speak of how they were told to stay silent or risk losing everything. The switch from flying saucer to weather balloon wasn't just public relations. It marked the beginning of a double storyline, one for the public and one for those who saw behind the curtain. In private, Marcel reportedly told his son that the real wreckage had been flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. In public, he smiled for the camera, holding scraps of a balloon he swore were not from the debris field. The truth about what was found at the Foster Ranch became buried beneath decades of denials, contradictions, and half-truths. For many, it stopped being about what happened and became a story of how hard the truth could be suppressed. Roswell had become something more than an incident. It was a turning point. What happened in Roswell didn't stay in Roswell. In the years that followed, witnesses began to speak. Not all at once, and not loudly, but steadily. One of the earliest was Glenn Dennis, a young mortician working at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. In the early 90s, he came forward with a startling account. In the summer of 1947, he received a series of unusual calls from the Roswell Army Airfield. They asked about small, hermetically sealed caskets, about how to handle bodies that had been exposed to the elements, and, most bizarrely, how to preserve tissue that had begun to decompose in the desert heat. Dennis later claimed a nurse at the base, whom he knew personally, described seeing bodies, small, humanoid, not quite human, slender limbs, oversized heads, skin with a grayish tone. She was visibly shaken, Days later, she vanished. Skeptics dismissed his story, but it wasn't the only one. In 1978, nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, who repeated what he had told family and friends for years. The debris was not of this world. This interview lit the fuse on the modern Roswell investigation. Suddenly, dozens of witnesses surfaced: former military police, nurses, radar operators, locals who had seen trucks rolling out under cover of darkness. They spoke of a second site, 20 miles away from the debris field, where an intact craft was found, and with it, bodies. Some claimed the bodies were taken to Fort Worth. Others said Wright-Patterson. A few pointed toward Hangar 84 at Roswell itself. Whatever the truth, something was moved. Something was hidden. And decades later, people still carry the burden of silence. One man, anonymous, dying of cancer, recorded a final message in 2002. In it, he stated, "They weren't ours, they weren't Russian, and they weren't weather balloons. What we pulled from that second site wasn't meant for this world." The whispers have never stopped. In fact, they've grown louder. Because if the witnesses are right, then Roswell wasn't just the birthplace of a mystery. It was a cover-up that continues to this day. For decades, the U.S. government denied any involvement in a cover-up surrounding the Roswell crash. But in 1994, the Air Force released a lengthy report attempting to explain what really happened in July of 1947. Their answer? Operation Mogul, designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive microphones. These balloons, according to the report, carried unconventional materials that could account for the wreckage Mac Brazel found. It was a plausible explanation, on the surface. The report included diagrams, timelines, even testimony from scientists and engineers. It stated that secrecy about the project had prompted the initial flying disc announcement, a misstep by an overzealous officer, and that the crash was entirely terrestrial in origin. But critics were quick to point out the gaps. For one, the materials described in the Mogul project didn't match the accounts of the strange memory metal, the hieroglyph-like markings, or the unusually shaped beams. And Mogul didn't account for the bodies. In a second report published in 1997, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the crash, the Air Force addressed these claims. They said that the bodies described by witnesses were likely crash test dummies used in later balloon experiments in the 1950s. The problem? Many of those witnesses placed the bodies in 1947, not a decade later. It raised a new question. Was the government rewriting the past? Or had the story become so muddled by time, memory, and myth that truth itself was lost? The term plausible deniability comes to mind. By offering an answer, even a weak one, the Air Force hoped to put the matter to rest. But instead of closing the book, it reopened every page. Today, many still believe Operation Mogul was real but incomplete, that it explained part of what happened in Roswell but not all, because something fell from the sky that night, something no government report can fully explain. 75 years after the crash, Roswell has transformed into something few could have predicted, a town where myth meets commerce, and where the unexplained has become a brand. Drive down Main Street, and you'll find alien-themed diners, souvenir shops, and the world-famous International UFO Museum and Research Center, which draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Roswell has become a beacon for believers, skeptics, and the simply curious. But behind the green-skinned figurines and glow-in-the-dark fridge magnets lies a deeper current, one of genuine inquiry and unresolved questions. Each July, the city hosts the Roswell UFO Festival, a multi-day event where former military officers, researchers, and eyewitnesses gather to share new findings, testimonies, and theories. Lectures, panels, even reenactments, what began as a local event is now a global phenomenon. Yet amidst the spectacle, the testimonies remain hauntingly consistent. Locals still talk about the military lockdown in 1947, of trucks blocking roads, of warnings to stay indoors, of the sense that something bigger was being hidden, just out of reach. Second and third generation witnesses, children and grandchildren of those involved, now tell the stories their relatives were too afraid to share publicly. One man, whose father worked as a mechanic on the base, described hearing muffled conversations about cargo that wasn't human. Another resident shared her grandmother's diary entry from July 9th. Strange lights over the mesa last night. Men in uniform at the diner, whispering, "Something is wrong. We aren't being told the truth." Roswell is no longer just a place. It's a lens, a way to view government secrecy, public trust, and our deepest hopes and fears about what lies beyond the stars. To some, it's still just a balloon. To others, it's the beginning of everything. Long after the headlines faded and the dust settled on the desert floor, Roswell remains unresolved. It continues to inspire films, books, podcasts, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. In classrooms and coffee shops, in classified halls and basement forums, one question lingers: what really happened in Roswell? Theories abound. That it was alien contact and the world wasn't ready. That it was a test craft, human, experimental, and dangerous to reveal. Or that it was a little of both. Something recovered, something replicated, and something too enormous to explain in one lifetime. As years pass, more files are declassified, more deathbed confessions emerge. Yet the center of the mystery remains untouched, as if protected by something larger than secrecy: time, memory, myth. Perhaps the power of Roswell isn't in whether it was a UFO or a balloon or something else entirely. Perhaps it's in what it represents: a fracture in public trust. A moment when people began to question what they were told and what they chose to believe. In the end, we are left with debris, not just of metal, but of belief. And from that wreckage, a movement was born. Thank you for listening to Episode 9, The Roswell Incident, Echoes of a Crash. If this journey through the fog of history kept you captivated, we ask you to like, share, and subscribe. New mysteries arrive every week, some resolved, some never will be. Until next time, keep watching the skies.